Good afternoon, Rochester. Peg Larson and John Call here, giving you what we think will be the final wrap-up. And one of the reasons why we've held off is that the governor has put forth demands, and even though he signed the supplemental budget bill that has all of the education, higher ed and regular ed in it, he is now asking for other things to be put into those bills. So if indeed they did have a special session, they would have to introduce another supplemental bill. So it would be kind of like the supplemental to the supplemental. One of the things that's in there, which probably affects everybody, is the fact that last year the legislature gave the Department of Education money to put forth an online IEP program, which everybody thought was going to be pretty good, save time, save money, save paperwork. And this year they took that money away. And that's one of the things that the governor wants put back in, and I think that's pretty logical. As far as having a special session, your guess is as good as mine. John and I have been talking about it. It's getting later and later, and I would say that Dowd maybe had it right to do it right away, except they still, to this day, have not agreed on transportation funding and on bonding and on what would be in the supplemental budget bill and the ID, which actually is a pretty big deal. The governor says he will call them back if they can agree, but there's a great level of distrust between all three of them. Whereas last year, Dowd and Bach kind of buddied up against the governor. This year, none of them trust each other, which is really slowing down the process. So John and I predict that there won't be a special session, that the people will just have to take blame for what didn't happen, and that ought to be really interesting come November. Some of the things that happened in education, the final education bill, which was after nights and nights of sitting in the Finance Conference Committee, and they had all of the subject areas in the Finance Conference Committee: environment, transportation, education, energy, judiciary. All of them had their times where they talked about, what they wouldn't do. And at many times it looked really good for the legislation that we put forward as far as the task force on reducing mandates. The Senate loved that. They thought it was a great idea. They were willing to put forth a task force. However, the House was not interested in that. As far as the task force on discipline, the Senate loved it. The House, I don't know if they loved it or they didn't love it, but they didn't put it forward. So they did put money into some other things that would help teachers remove children from the classroom who are being disruptive. Now, I just think that's probably already a given, but it should be interesting to see how that works. $25 million is going into the pot for ongoing pre-K, and that was the governor's demand, and he took that money out of the general fund, because as you know, education had a zero budget target. Everybody gets a target from the surplus or whatever there is. And this year, education had a zero target, and they were taking $53 million in the form of paybacks from any school district who had a maximum effort loan. And what they wanted to do was forgive those loans in terms of you would pay it back all at one time, and you would go out and bond for it, and they would save all that interest, and they would end up with $53 million. Well, at first that was optional, and you could see the handwriting on the wall. Eventually it would become mandatory, which it has become mandatory. They did $12.1 million one-time money for student support services such as counselors. It's interesting that for how badly we need counselors and counseling services in our schools, that they only did one-time money. Hopefully this will be followed up in the actual budget year next year. I can't see them hiring all these people and then having to let them go once they start to get things organized. And even at $12.1 million, that's barely scratching the surface. $4.9 million was for non-metro equity. which is great in terms of, it used to be called location equity services. Now this year, everybody will get that money. However, if you want it to continue, you have to levy it. So this is the hidden tax in the education bill. Once you depend on that money, once you get it, then you will have to tax your constituents, your citizens, to continue that money, which I don't know how that's going to roll. $4.5 million for staff development in intermediate districts, which we are not that interested in. But they do have a $2.8 million grant for teachers in shortage areas. And quite truthfully, I think almost everywhere around the state has a teacher shortage. The higher education bill does talk about allowing teachers to have different types of licenses and come into the state and have provisional licenses. They're calling them now professional licenses, and they can be renewed, I think, every 5 years. They did put $2.8 million for positive behavior intervention supports. As I said, that really is our disciplinary piece. But the way it reads, it's not really a hammer that teachers feel that they need to deal with kids that are really being unruly. $2 million for parent visits, which will be spread throughout the state. $2 million for teacher loan forgiveness, which your teachers should be very happy about. $2 million for Parent Aware. $500,000 for Innovation Partners Centers, and $500,000 for teacher governed schools, which ought to be interesting. There's also $500,000 for broadband innovation grants, which you need to apply for as soon as possible. St. Cloud did get their early learning program that we asked for Rochester. Just a guess here that St. Cloud and Chair Nobla of the Ways and Means may have something to do with how St. Cloud got it and not Rochester. It's also interesting that in the higher education bill, there is language for concurrent enrollment. And one of the things that I find very interesting is the fact that school districts have to notify parents that there is such a thing as concurrent enrollment and work with higher ed to make sure that students who qualify for that will be able to take advantage of that. We did have the funding for restoring money for the regional centers, and that was right into the very last minute. In fact, I do believe that it is in the bill to give some money to the regional centers, of which Rochester has some. I cannot find it on the spreadsheets, but I am told by those who know that it is in there. Okay, one of the other things that they talked about was the ACT test and the SAT test, and it was really kind of a rowdy discussion, and then it went behind closed doors. And it came out that the ACT or the SAT must consider the Minnesota Comprehensive Assessment Test. And there will still be money for the ACT and the SAT to be taken off campus. And those students will still be reimbursed no matter where they take those tests. But they must consider the Minnesota Comprehensive Assessment Test. Mental health grants did not make it through in terms of the grants, but they're saying that the counselors are what they're putting towards mental health at this point in time. There's still so much work to be done that was laid on the table and walked away from. I have to give Chair Uyghur just a tremendous amount of credit. He heard, I believe, every bill that came in front of him. And of course, in his committee, it's rolled over for possible inclusion, but the senators on his committee could show their support, and they did for a lot of the things that Rochester brought forward. The special ed mandates will be lowered, but they don't know right now which ones they will do. And Senator Stump was able to get $240,000 for interim money for QComp, but not money to put QComp across the board. And that's only for this year. A lot of things were put into the world's best workforce that had not been in there before. And so that that title and that umbrella is growing and growing. So that will, I'm sure, be back next year for different funding for all of the things that are underneath that. As I said, the Senate was really pretty generous. The House had two separate bills, a policy bill and a finance bill, whereas the Senate had the finance bill and the policy bill wrapped into one. And so did some of the other committees, and that's what caused some of the consternation at the end of session. And basically what they did after discussion and not taking any testimony during the conference committee, they basically went behind closed doors and cut the bill. And they came out with provisions that were agreed upon in the K-12 bill, and then the proposed agreement looked something like this. And then they came out with, they submitted to conference committee for their provisions, and it was one page out of all of the things that were taken by both committees, especially the Senate committee. That's all that came out of the bill. As I said, the governor has signed the supplemental budget bill, and there are a few things in there for education that he wants to see put back in or changed. None of them have to do with preschool, which is kind of a relief. But we said it before, and I guess it's worth saying again, or at least noting again, that some people work very, very hard for education. Our legislators in Rochester, Pearson, Nelson, Kim Norton, many people worked really hard, especially Kim and Senjum, carried legislation for us and really pushed hard to get it through. It was pretty much a done deal, I think, probably halfway through the Finance Conference Committee. And the pathetic thing is the Finance Conference Committee did not get its targets until the day before the last night. And then that's when they put it together, and basically they had nothing to work with. So we did as best we could. I know a lot of people were working together to get more, and we will be happy to meet with you sometime in the interim and go over the bill more in detail. Thank you.
So as Peg indicated, the Senate giveth and the House taketh away. And the process, as I've stated in the past, was an abomination. As far as the special session is concerned, as Peg pointed out, it's at best a dim flicker of hope. The only thing that could produce a special session at this point is legislators out door knocking and getting a lot of feedback that makes them think maybe they ought to be learning how to make some compromises. The differences are quite vast, and like Peg said, it's a dim hope. July 1st is, kind of one of those imaginary lines in the sand, because after July 1st, the provisions in the tax bill would have to be totally rewritten, and so people are whispering the date June 23rd. I still don't see how that's going to happen. The focus of the special session would be limited to a tax bill and a bonding bill. I cannot see how they're going to get together on a transportation bill at this late date. So that will be the focus. I'd like to leave you with one additional thought. And there was an article in MinnPost a couple days ago by an economist. And this is a concern I've had all along too, is that there are business cycles. There are troubling signs in Minnesota's and the national economy right now. From November 5th of 2015 until February of this year, there was a $900 million decrease in the projected revenue stream. Now that's a warning sign. There were still $500 or $600 million left, but they wanted to spend a lot of that. So the most likely scenario, if the tax bill passes and spends another $600 million in the next 3 years, is that the surplus at the end of this biennium is going to be minuscule. Projecting forward into the 2018-2019 biennium, which is admittedly a ways off, we are looking at possibly $1 billion deficit already. So the fact that there isn't a tax bill or a special session may just save us from some misery that we're going to get ourselves into because we don't seem to understand business cycles and economic cycles. So I don't know that there's going to be any need for us to communicate with you any further about the special session, but if there is one, we will be back giving you reports on what's going on in that special session. To reiterate Peg's offer, if it would be useful for us to come down and talk more about this to the board, we're happy to do so. I also think we should not wait too long to start thinking about the next biennium. It's going to be the spending year. It's the year in which the governor puts together the budget. And I think we should start thinking early about the strategy we want to use to approach that session. With that, we wish you a great summer, some time with your family, some relaxation, and we'll be talking to you at some point in the hopefully not too distant future. Thank you.